In today's session, I'm going to take you through a composition using two separate tangles, one called Triplex by Natalia Orlova and another called Catkin by Mimi Lempart. As you can see here, I've begun to draw the triplex by putting down three orbs or circles that will form the center of this flower-like shape. And then we will create three sets of petals going outward from that center. So you'll see that here. And each of these is drawn by just creating a wavy line and then coming back to the point of origin on each side. And you just repeat that process for the number of times that you are preferring to do. There's no set number that you need to have. It's just that obviously the more you make, the larger that flowering shape will become. So in this case, I think I chose five lines to do on each petal so that I would have a comparable way to maintain a little symmetry on that shape. And you'll see here that I end there with the first petal. And now I'm going to begin drawing the second petal. The petals are somewhat fan-shaped and just sort of build outward. You can also do things where you add double lines and then a wider line and narrow lines, just anything that you would like to do to add variety to those petals, but they're created in the same general fashion here where we just go outward. Now I'll draw several of these shapes all together and you'll see how each one is created. And of course, drawing behind there as we come up against another shape. But just radiating outward with these petal areas. Now you'll see here in a few moments as I begin to do the second part to this tangle by adding different patterns, shapes, and ideas within each of these radiating layers. It's literally endless what you could do to them as far as how they could be embellished, what sort of details you could add, and so on. But I start off by just inking in the centers. And once that's done, I make a few decisions here on the fly and start drawing some orbs into alternating bands on those petals. And of course, that's not the only options that you have. As I mentioned a moment ago, you can fill these petals or the various bands within the petals with nearly any shape, embellishment, or tangle idea that you have. I just chose these off the cuff and wanted to add some sort of detail to them so they weren't quite so plain. Now for the second shape, I just decided to use very simple lines or hash marks to add a little bit of additional detail to the bands of the petals for this flower shape. Again, I altered each band, which is a pattern that I followed throughout this particular drawing. Now on the third flower shape here, I wasn't exactly certain where I was going with this. I just started laying down some dots to follow along those band lines, and I don't know if it was my science fiction brain kicking in again or what, but I suddenly thought to myself, you know, that kind of looks neat, like little rivets that maybe the other two flowers are more natural botanicals, and this one is maybe an assembled or mechanical botanical, we'll call it. So I just went with that very simple series of dots to accentuate that flower. Now I moved on to the next tangle, which is the catkin tangle. And that tangle is done using little branches or twig-looking shapes, so I wanted to lay those out into the general composition here before I started finalizing what they look like. Just tried to create an interesting natural set of curves here with little branches and twigs coming off. Trying to fill space without getting too busy. Now, another thing that I like to do whenever I draw little branch shapes like this, whether it's a tangle or some other type of drawing, I like to make them look a little less like just a line or a, when was the last time you saw a stick or a twig or a branch that was perfectly straight and smooth? Pretty much never in my book. So I just take the pen and I make little wobbly marks as I go, and then ink in whenever a white spot occurs, and I just sort of thicken the lines and make them seem a little more twig-like or branch-like. And so that's the process I'm doing here. Just trying to make those look a little more interesting, of course, is always the catchphrase, but also to make them look a little more like actual twigs or branches. Once I get those kind of laid in, then I can start adding that secondary shape for the catkin tangle. And we do this by making a simple little hook, I call it, on any area on the branch that you think you want to place the catkin. And then you round across the top and just connect the two with some dots in between. They can be slightly different sizes, and some can be a little fatter looking and some a little thinner looking. There's no right or wrong way, but the process is the same. You just choose a spot on the branch, you create the little hook, then you come up and around and add that simple line and dots, and you create this little shape that looks kind of like a puffy little fluff ball hanging off the side of that branch. Of course, you can place them wherever you would like. You can try to make it look natural, or you can make it look crazy. Whatever you want to do, that's up to you. Now that the basic composition is finished with the two tangle patterns, we can begin the shading process. But just before I do that, I decided to add a boldness to the outer lines of each of these petal shapes. I didn't want them to get lost in the drawing, especially once I start to add graphite. It can be harder to discern lines from each other. So it's just a way to add a little boldness to that. It adds a subtle amount of contrast as well, but it just helps those lines to be more clearly visible. And so I just used a heavier nib pen and traced over the outside shape of each of the petals. So now I can actually begin laying in some graphite that we will use for shading. And I just mainly went around the outer edge wherever the petal shapes overlapped, and then also along the crease lines where the petals came together, those sort of intersections. And then I added just a tiny bit in the bottom of each of the catkin shapes so that I could create a little bit of a difference in value on those shapes as well. Now here I'm using the tortillon without adding any new graphite. I'm just using the graphite built up on the tortillon itself, and I begin to add some very light shadows to different areas of these petal shapes to help indicate folds, bends, or subtle curves that might help to give more of a sense of volume, shape, and dimension to these little tangle patterns. And so here is the finished composition and drawing. And I wanted to show you a color version as well. It's basically the same composition and very similar pattern, but just used alcohol markers to color it. And that's the session for today. But thank you very much for joining with me. I hope to see you all again real soon. Take care. Bye-bye.